Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily News for Tuesday, March 8th. And today, on International Women's Day 2022, a new report has been released suggesting women still face a broken rung when trying to move up the corporate ladder. The report by McKinsey & Company shows Canadian companies are hiring near equal numbers of men and women for junior positions, but when it comes to management levels, women's representation drops by 12%. Sandrine Deviere says the outlook is even worse for racialized women who are less likely than white women or men to be promoted. All right, turning to Canada's efforts in the Ukraine war now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada will stand with the Baltic states to fight the Kremlin's war on Ukraine and its cyber attacks around the world. Mr. Trudeau is in Latvia today, where he met privately with Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš. This is followed by an expanded session via teleconference with leaders from Estonia and Lithuania. He says their countries are on the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine, which is now in its 13th day. But he says Russia's cyber attacks are also troubling as an attempt to undermine democracies around the world. Mr. Trudeau met with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at the NATO mission north of Riga. There he committed to a multi-year renewal of Operation Reassurance. A recent move by the U.S. in the Ukraine conflict has led to gas prices hitting a record $4.17 U.S. a gallon this morning. This was on news that the Biden administration is banning Russian oil imports. The average price has jumped 10 cents per gallon in the past days and 55 cents in the past week. Gas prices are soaring across Canada as well, with prices in Nova Scotia jumping almost 11 cents at midnight to $1.86 per litre. To the West Coast now, as British Columbia has changed the conditions of its environmental assessment certificate for the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. This while telling the federal government that it still has concerns about the response plans for potential marine oil spills. In a letter outlining the changes, Environment Minister George Heyman and Energy Minister Bruce Ralston urged Federal Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson to adopt a series of recommendations to address concerns that fall under his jurisdiction. A Trans Mountain spokesperson says it is reviewing the changes to the certificate to determine its next steps. All right, well, meanwhile, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says his government will not follow Alberta's lead by reducing a provincial tax on gasoline. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney announced yesterday that he is reducing his own province's gasoline tax by 13 cents a litre. Saskatchewan has one of the country's highest sales tax on gasoline and diesel fuel at 15 cents a litre. Saskatchewan's opposition NDP is urging the government to cut its 15 cents per litre tax on gasoline and diesel to offer drivers some relief. The Assistant Commissioner of the RCMP says Mounties only gave banks the names of people directly involved in Ottawa protests in order to freeze their accounts to encourage them to leave. Michelle Arcand told the House of Commons Finance Committee yesterday the RCMP did not send banks the names of anyone who simply donated to the so-called Freedom Convoy or the names of people involved in protests outside of the capital. The committee is studying the Trudeau government's use of the Emergencies Act to end a 3-week occupation in downtown Ottawa and other blockades at some key border crossings. Back in BC, the mayor of Lytton says a long-awaited start to rebuilding his fire-ravaged village is expected today. Jan Polderman says provincially funded work to remove debris from the wildfire that destroyed much of the Fraser Canyon community 8 months ago is the first step before the town can be rebuilt. He expects people will be rebuilding their destroyed homes by September. In Ontario, student unions and youth advocacy groups are calling on the provincial government to ensure free menstrual products are made available on all post-secondary campuses across the province. The initiative aims to tackle menstrual inequity and period poverty. In a letter being sent to Premier Doug Ford's government today on International Women's Day, the Toronto Youth Cabinet and numerous student unions are calling for universities and colleges to be forced to provide free menstrual products by the end of the year. The group wants to build on the progress the province made in October when it announced a plan to have free products in other schools. Team Canada continues its winning streak at the Paralympics. Mark Arends from Hartsville PEI won the gold medal in the 10-kilometer standing biathlon event in Beijing. He was the only athlete in the field to go a perfect 20 for 20 on the shooting range. His gold was his second medal in Beijing and the 10th of his career. It was Canada's only podium performance today, bringing the medal total to 13. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the ripple effects of Russia's invasion in Ukraine include major disruptions to the United Nations food program. He says the impact of that invasion goes far beyond soaring energy prices, and the world must respond. Ukraine is one of the world's major wheat exporters, and since Russia's attack, global wheat prices have risen to levels not seen since 2008. Global Affairs Canada Assistant Deputy Minister Sandra McArdle says Canada is already making contingency plans to support countries that rely heavily on wheat exports from Ukraine. With us to discuss food insecurity in Canada and around the world is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you.
So let's start with how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting food security around the world.
Well, in the agri-food sector, everything is interconnected. What happens, if something happens in the Ukraine, it will eventually catch up to us. When you look at prices, availability, and obviously the conflict in that region is clearly impacting access and the ability of that region to export as well. And that region is responsible for over 25% of world exports for wheat and corn specifically. And so those are key ingredients for the entire agri-food sector around the globe. The other issue, of course, are fertilizers. Without proper fertilizers, without access to fertilizers, you can't grow more, which is why global food security is a little unnerving right now.
And at the same time, we hear the Prime Minister saying this invasion will disrupt the UN World Food Program. So what is the significance of this, and how does this connect to Canada?
Well, absolutely. So growing anything will be difficult this year. So the UN program will be impacted, no doubt. So this is not a good thing. It's not happening at the right. Well, it's a world conflict. Obviously, it's war, but it couldn't have happened at a worse time, given the fact that supply chains were experiencing some major challenges over the last 6 months, and now with this war happening in the Ukraine. Again, we will see food prices around the world increase, including in Canada, US, and elsewhere.
And we know Canada is known for its wheat exports as well. So what is the scale of Canada's involvement in global wheat exports?
So actually, we export slightly more than the Ukraine, but not much, which is why, I mean, if something were to happen in Canada, we may actually see the same kind of impact around the world. But Canada is not as complicated as Europe, as you know. And so that's why a lot of investments are coming our way. However, to balance things out, you really need Europe's bread basket to function quite well. And Ukraine right now, along with Belarus and Russia, aren't necessarily well, we're not looking at a very, very productive harvest for this year as a result of the conflict, so which will actually disrupt markets for a very long time.
And you mentioned earlier the cost of fertilizer is rising, so is the cost of fuel. So how would this affect farmers and consumers within Canada?
So farmers obviously are very concerned about fertilizers. They've been concerned about fertilizers for months now because of supply chain problems. But now with this conflict, we are expecting fertilizer prices to move even more. We're hoping that Canadian companies like Nutrien and Mosaic will see their roles a little bit differently this year, instead of trying to capitalize on strong demand for fertilizers. So it's a hope and see sort of scenario. As for consumers, oil is the big story right now. We are expecting oil prices to impact food prices early on due to higher transportation costs.
All right, Dr. Charlebois, just about a minute left here, but what are some other items that Canadian consumers should expect to see the biggest jumps in?
So over the short term, oil is the big story with transportation costs. Midterm, 3 to 6 months, if the conflict continues, we are expecting grain-based food products to be impacted. Bakery, center of the store sort of products will be impacted. And over the long term, we are expecting yet again animal proteins to be impacted. So looking at the meat trifecta, pork, chicken, and beef, we're expecting higher prices at the meat counter. And finally, over a year, dairy and eggs could be impacted.
All right, Dr. Charlebois, thank you again for your time today.
My pleasure.
Stay with us. Coming up next, riot police block a Women's Day march in Istanbul. Ukraine's president gives a speech to British Parliament. COVID-19 requirements for Canadian cruise ships are announced by the federal government. And BC is promising that every home and community will have high-speed internet service. That and more coming up next. Riot police blocked an International Women's Day march in Istanbul, Turkey, again this year. Police set up barricades and fired pepper gas to block demonstrators from joining the march and detained at least 38 women. Demonstrators use Women's Day events to press for strong measures to prevent violence against women by former partners or family members. The We Will Stop Femicide platform reports at least 73 women have been killed in Turkey since the start of this year. Turning to the ongoing battle in Ukraine now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has delivered a historic speech to the British Parliament, saying his country will not give up and will not lose. Mr. Zelensky channeled Second World War Prime Minister Winston Churchill, vowing Ukrainians would fight the Russian invaders in cities, fields, and riverbanks, whatever the cost. He thanked Britain for its help so far and urged MPs to increase sanctions on Russia and designate it as a terrorist country. The UN Human Rights Office has confirmed 474 civilians have died and 861 have been wounded since the start of the war. But it admits the actual figures are likely much higher. McDonald's is also stepping in as the war rages on in Ukraine. It is temporarily closing all of its 850 restaurants in Russia, saying the company's values mean that it can't ignore the needless human suffering within Ukraine. The burger giant said it will continue paying its 62,000 employees and that it's impossible to know when the stores might reopen. The parent company of KFC and Pizza Hut announced yesterday that it's donating all of the profits from its more than 1,000 restaurants in Russia to humanitarian efforts, as is Starbucks. Back here in Canada, Transport Minister Omar Alghabra says his department has fined 6 passengers who were on board a Sunwing flight last year that evolved into an on-board party. Videos of the December 30th charter voyage from Montreal to Cancun, Mexico, shared on social media, showed unmasked passengers in close proximity partying. Transport Canada says a half-dozen passengers who were not fully vaccinated when they boarded have now received penalties that could reach a maximum of $5,000 each. Under COVID-19 rules, all passengers must be fully vaccinated to board a flight departing Canada. The flight took off about 2 weeks after the federal government advised Canadians to avoid non-essential travel outside of Canada. From air travel to the cruise ship industry, Ottawa is announcing strict COVID-19 rules for the return of cruise ships to Canada. Transport Minister Omar Alghabra says cruise ship employees and passengers must be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. He says passengers will also need to take COVID-19 tests before and after boarding a vessel and won't be allowed off cruise ships unless they meet the requirements. He says the health measures are an important step to assist the return of a lucrative industry. Minister Alghabra says the requirements will be overseen by cruise ship operators and will be enforced by the Canada Border Services Agency. In Ontario, MP Leslyn Lewis is going to take another run at the Conservative Party leadership. She declared her candidacy in a 45-second-long video on social media. MP Pierre Poilievre announced last month that he is running for the party's top job, and former Quebec Premier Jean Charest is expected to officially enter the race on Thursday. In the West Coast, the federal and British Columbia governments are spending $830 million to provide access to high-speed internet across the province. In a news release, the province says the plan means many First Nations communities will have high-speed internet access for the first time. BC is promising that every home and community will have the service by 2027. This was also promised in the budget announced last month. The funding will be evenly split between the federal and provincial governments. It will cover the cost of infrastructure, including low-orbit satellites or fixed and fiber internet connected to homes and businesses. Turning to the east now, where the Nova Scotia government wants international film and TV producers to know that the province is a place where they can do business. Premier Tim Houston has announced the government is pumping $8 million into a project to build a new soundstage and $15 million over 5 years to boost local film and TV productions. Next week, Mr. Houston and industry officials are flying to Los Angeles to meet with executives from Disney, Netflix, NBC Universal, and other studios to promote the province as a production destination. All right, well, meanwhile, the Toronto Film Critics Association has awarded the coming-of-age drama Beans the $100,000 prize for Best Canadian Feature at a gala dinner. Director Tracy Deer was named the winner of the Rogers Best Canadian Film Award. Guests at last night's event were tested for COVID-19 in advance and had to wear masks when they weren't eating or drinking. We'll be back after the break with news from around the world. Stay tuned. It's a global day to celebrate women on this International Women's Day. But many females fleeing Ukraine are feeling only the stress of finding new life for their children as brothers, husbands, and fathers stay behind to defend their country from Russia's military invasion. The United Nations says the number of refugees fleeing Ukraine in the past 13 days has reached 2 million. Polina Shulga tried to ease the journey for her 3-year-old daughter by hiding the truth, instead explaining that they're going on vacation and they'll definitely come home one day when the war is over. Ukraine's defense minister is estimating Russian forces have killed over 400 civilians, including at least 38 children. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and UNICEF are confirming these numbers, that 2 million people, half of them children, have fled Ukraine. Europe's worst refugee crisis since the Second World War has seen Poland take in more than 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees, which is the most of any nation. A 12-hour ceasefire is allowing civilians in one eastern Ukrainian city to leave on buses. Russia and Ukraine have agreed to establish 5 safe corridors for people to escape the fighting. The ongoing war is also impacting global energy prices. The average price for gasoline in the U.S. is hitting a record $4.17 per gallon. This comes as the country announces a ban on Russian oil imports after its invasion of Ukraine. The UK is also announcing a ban on oil and oil product imports from Russia, with the phase-out completed by the end of the year. Russia's war is also impacting the prices of another global commodity. Trading in nickel has been suspended on the London Metal Exchange after prices doubled to a record $100,000 per metric ton. Russia is the world's 3rd biggest nickel producer. The LME says trading in nickel will not resume today and that the halt could continue due to the geopolitical situation causing recent price moves. Turning to the ongoing efforts to secure a nuclear deal with Iran, as world powers await Tehran's decision in negotiations to restore Iran's tattered deal, its state-run news agency says the country's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard has launched a 2nd satellite into space. IRNA reported today that the Guard launched the Noor-2 into a low orbit around the Earth. Meanwhile, images taken from space reveal concerning realities about North Korea's nuclear program. Commercial satellite images suggest construction is resuming at the country's nuclear testing ground. This comes nearly 4 years after leader Kim Jong-un declared the site's closure and invited foreign journalists to observe the destruction of tunnels ahead of his first summit with then U.S. President Donald Trump. Moving to the global fight against COVID-19 now, as the World Health Organization says a group of experts is strongly supporting urgent and broad access to booster doses of COVID-19 vaccines to fight the global spread of the Omicron variant. It is a reversal of the UN agency's insistence last year that boosters weren't necessary and contributed to vaccine inequity. The panel says vaccination, including the use of boosters, is especially important for people at risk of severe disease. Some good news in the fight against racism and hate in the U.S. After more than 200 failed attempts, the U.S. Congress has approved legislation that would make lynching a federal hate crime. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act now goes to President Joe Biden to be signed into law. It was named for the black teenager whose brutal killing in Mississippi in 1955 and his mother's insistence on an open casket to show the world what was done to her child became a pivotal moment in the civil rights era. Turning to Guatemala now, as red-hot rock and ash are flowing down the slopes of the country's volcano of fire. About 500 residents evacuated voluntarily and moved into shelters. 4 years ago, an eruption of the over 3,700-meter-high volcano of fire killed 194 people and left another 234 missing. Big moves being made in the EU. The European Union's executive arm wants to harmonize the criminalization of sexual assault across the 27-nation bloc on the strict basis of lack of consent. According to data, 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced physical or sexual violence since the age of 15. In addition, 1 in 2 have experienced sexual harassment, with 1 in 20 women reporting having been assaulted. The large majority of EU member countries already treat violence against women and girls as a crime, but the Commission said there are gaps in national legislation. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.